CEO walked into his own meeting, but the chair at the head of the table, the seat where he had always sat, was gone. The door had opened with its usual weighted click, and Daniel Cross stepped into the boardroom he had walked into hundreds of times before. Yet this time, the atmosphere was not familiar. The polished table stretched long and immaculate under the pale ceiling lights, but instead of warmth or acknowledgement, there was silence. Conversations that had been buzzing only moments earlier stopped instantly. Heads turned for the briefest second, then turned away, as though his arrival was an inconvenience. He froze for half a heartbeat. This was his room. For 10 years, every major decision had begun right here. He had guided the company through financial storms, pulled it back from the edge more than once, fought with competitors who wanted to see it collapse. And yet, the people seated around the table avoided his eyes. Where his chair should have been the heavy leather seat at the head of the table, there was nothing. The space was empty, and, in its place, a silver nameplate glinted under the light. The letters were clean and sharp. Victor Hale. Victor sat behind it, leaning back, one arm resting on the armrest, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. He looked at ease, comfortable, like a man who already owned the room. 2 directors sat close on either side of him, their papers spread, pens in hand. A moment earlier, they had been speaking with him in hushed voices, but now they looked down, busying themselves with notes that didn't need writing. Daniel scanned the table. There were 12 directors present. Every single one of them kept their attention fixed anywhere but on him. A cough. A throat cleared. Pages turned unnecessarily. No greeting. No acknowledgement. The air itself seemed to say, "You don't belong here." Daniel adjusted his grip on the handle of his briefcase. It was worn now. Edges frayed, but he carried it every day. That briefcase had seen everything: the early years of unpaid invoices, desperate pitches, long flights to meetings where he begged for contracts that never came. It was his symbol of endurance. Yet here, inside the room he had built his career around, it felt out of place. Victor spoke first. His voice was smooth, practiced, carrying just enough civility to mask the blade underneath. "Daniel," he said, with that thin smile, "we'll take it from here. You can sit this one out." The words struck hard. The phrasing wasn't random. Sit this one out. As though he were a substitute, someone extra, no longer necessary. No one challenged the remark. One director pretended to check her watch. Another adjusted his glasses, eyes dropping instantly when Daniel's gaze reached him. A security officer stood near the wall, arms folded, watching Daniel and no one else. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone carried the message. If Daniel resisted, he would be escorted out. The injustice wasn't shouted. It lived in silence. It lived in the scraping of chairs that had been pulled closer together, in the subtle shift of papers toward Victor's side, in the lack of even a polite, "Good morning." Daniel stepped further into the room, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. The sound echoed too loudly, making the silence even heavier. He looked toward the empty spot where his chair should have stood. Nothing but empty space, polished, as if no one had ever sat there. The deliberate erasure was unmistakable. He thought of what that chair had meant. Not just a seat. It was the physical reminder that he had built this company. He had been there when the office barely had functioning heating, when he drove his own car to pick up shipments, when he mortgaged his home to make payroll. That chair wasn't just furniture. It was proof that the sacrifices had mattered. And now, it was gone. Victor's voice cut again, calm, dismissive. "The board has already reviewed today's agenda. We'll handle the decisions without distraction." The word distraction lingered like poison. Daniel watched the reactions. A few directors nodded faintly. None looked at him. Their silence was consent. Daniel's jaw tightened. He moved toward the empty head of the table, then stopped. Slowly, He lowered his briefcase to the floor. The thud echoed across the room. A few directors flinched at the sound, heads snapping toward him before turning away again. Even Victor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniel said nothing. His silence unsettled them more than words could. He scanned their faces. Every one of them owed something to him. He remembered helping one director save a failing department, another secure funding for a risky project, another who had begged for time when his numbers were collapsing. He had been there for all of them, and now they pretended he wasn't even in the room. He remembered nights when his wife left dinner covered on the table because he wouldn't be home before midnight. Birthdays missed. Promises broken to his children because he was chasing contracts across the country. The weight of years pressed into him. And now these people, who had benefited from every ounce of his sacrifice, chose to erase him with silence. Victor leaned forward, tone clipped. "Daniel, you should go. The meeting will proceed more smoothly that way." No one spoke against it. One director scribbled something on his notepad, though the page was blank. Another shuffled papers unnecessarily. The boardroom had chosen sides. Daniel stood still. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his jacket and kept his eyes on the table. The security officer took a single step forward, as if ready. Daniel glanced at him once, then back to Victor. The message was clear: leave quietly or be made to leave. The humiliation burned. But Daniel stayed calm. His breath evened, steady. If you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible, like your place had been taken without a word, you know the sting of that silence. That's why I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts here. Stories like this don't just belong to one man. They belong to anyone who's ever been told they don't matter. Victor smirked, sensing victory. "We're moving forward. Thank you for your understanding." Daniel didn't respond. He reached down, rested a hand on the briefcase at his feet, and let the silence answer for him. The board shifted uncomfortably. Some directors glanced at one another, nervous, unsure how to interpret his refusal to leave. The room, which had been firmly in Victor's control, no longer felt steady. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence. Quiet. Controlled. "You've mistaken patience for weakness, but I am still here." The words were simple, but they landed with weight. The directors shifted again, some frowning, some avoiding his eyes altogether. Even Victor's smirk thinned. Daniel leaned back slightly, his presence calm but immovable. And if moments like this resonate with you, where silence speaks louder than shouting, I invite you to stay with this channel. There are many stories here about dignity, betrayal, and holding your ground. When you follow along, you'll always have a place in these conversations. The room stayed tense, the air heavy, no one daring to speak. For the first time since he entered, it was clear. Daniel wasn't leaving. The boardroom had already made its choice. The silence wasn't a pause. It was a verdict. Daniel felt it in the way their eyes moved past him, in the way their hands clutched pens that didn't write, in the way Victor spoke as though the matter was already closed. He stood at the edge of the table, his chair gone, his place erased. He was not a guest. He was an exile in his own kingdom. Victor adjusted his cufflinks, his movements unhurried, designed to project control. "We'll move forward now," he said. "Daniel, I'm sure you understand. You've carried this company long enough. But every reign has its end. It's time for new leadership." The words were cold, measured. But what stung more was the quiet nods around the table. No one spoke up, but their silence was permission. Daniel looked at each of them. He saw faces that had once leaned on him in desperation. He remembered the calls late at night, requests for funding, for second chances, for forgiveness of mistakes that would have sunk careers. He had given them all what they asked, and here they were, watching him as though he were a relic, a man past usefulness. He thought back to the earliest days, when the company had no boardroom, no polished table, no suits lining the walls. Back then, it was a rented office above a shuttered store. He worked 16-hour days, sleeping on a couch that sagged in the middle, eating whatever cheap food he could buy. His wife had brought their children by sometimes, setting them on his lap while he typed with one hand. She used to remind him to breathe. "Don't forget you're human, Daniel," she'd say, smiling, even when he was too exhausted to respond. All of that sacrifice, all of that pain, had built what now stood before him. And the very people who benefited most were the ones who had erased his chair. The security officer shifted again, a subtle reminder that he wasn't expected to stay. Victor noticed it too. "Escort him if necessary," Victor said lightly, as though he were discussing coffee orders. The officer nodded once, firm but calm. Daniel's chest tightened. Not fear, clarity. They had already decided he was gone. He turned slowly toward the door. His footsteps echoed, heavy against the floor, each one measured. At the threshold, his hand brushed the metal handle. He could leave. That would be simple. He could walk out and let them have what they wanted. But as he touched the handle, a memory cut through the weight of the room. His father's voice, years ago, when Daniel was only a boy. "Never leave your house with the door open for thieves." Daniel paused. He released the handle. Then, with deliberate calm, he carried his briefcase to the head of the table, the place where his chair had once been, and lowered it to the ground. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. The directors looked up, startled. Their eyes darted to Victor, then back to Daniel. Victor's smile flickered, irritation creeping into the corners. Daniel remained standing. His voice came low, quiet but clear. "If this is the kingdom I built, why am I the exile?" No one answered. The words hung in the air, pressing on every person in the room. Victor recovered quickly. "Because you've lost sight of the future," he said, his tone firm, meant to reassert dominance. "We're not ungrateful. But times change, leaders change. And if you won't accept that, then you only make this harder for everyone." The directors shifted uncomfortably. One of them coughed. Another adjusted a tie. No one looked Daniel in the eye. Daniel's jaw flexed. He scanned the table slowly. The same men and women who had once cheered his victories now sat in silence as his rival cut him down. The betrayal was complete, not in their words, but in their refusal to speak at all. He remembered the night he had flown back from a failed negotiation years ago. It was 3 a.m, the house dark. His daughter had left a note on the kitchen table. "We miss you. Please come home before we're grown." He kept that note folded in his wallet for years, a reminder of what his ambition had cost his family. He had promised himself it was worth it, that building the company would secure a future for them all. And here he was, standing in the boardroom he had sacrificed his family for, being told he was no longer welcome. Victor leaned back again, satisfied. "Gentlemen, ladies, let's proceed. We'll call the vote of no confidence. Daniel's seat is vacant. It's time to fill it permanently." The words hit like a gavel. Daniel's breath steadied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He stepped to the side, pulled out a chair from the far end of the table, and sat down. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. The scrape of the chair echoed harshly. The directors froze. Victor's eyes narrowed. Daniel folded his hands on the table, calm, collected. "I'll stay," he said quietly. Victor scoffed. "You can sit, Daniel, but it won't change what's already been decided." Daniel didn't respond. His silence filled the room, heavier than any outburst could. If you've ever been in a place where people you trusted erased you with nothing more than silence, you understand what this moment feels like. And if you've lived through it, I'd like to hear your story. Share it here, because when voices combine, silence doesn't win. The boardroom grew tense. Every director sensed that something had shifted. The man they thought they had exiled was not leaving. He was claiming space, even without a chair at the head. Victor tried to speak again, louder this time, trying to reclaim control. Then stay. Stay and watch the future pass you by. It changes nothing. But Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice cold now, precise. It changes everything, because I'm not here as a guest. I'm here as the man who built this company, and I will not walk out of my own house. The room stilled. The directors looked at him differently now, not as a man leaving, but as a man who refused to be erased. And if you find meaning in this kind of story about betrayal, dignity, and standing where you're told you can't, consider following along with this channel. Each story here is a reminder that silence doesn't define you. Presence does. Daniel leaned back in his chair, steady, unshaken. For the first time that morning, the boardroom realized he was not going anywhere. The scrape of the chair Daniel had pulled from the far end still echoed in the room. No one spoke, but the weight of the act settled heavily across the board. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded his chair back. He had simply refused to leave. That refusal spoke louder than anything else. Victor forced a chuckle, a sound too sharp, too forced. Sit, Daniel, if it makes you feel better. But nothing you do here will change the outcome. Daniel's hands rested lightly on the table. His face betrayed nothing. But the calm silence was not surrender. It was defiance. The directors shifted uncomfortably. They whispered to each other, heads leaning close. He caught fragments. Is this wise? What if? He won't just... The whispers were nervous, unsure. For the first time that morning, doubt had entered the room. Daniel looked around the table. He remembered each face, each moment of dependence. He had given them everything: resources when no one else believed in them, second chances when mistakes nearly destroyed projects, trust when others wanted them fired. They all owed him pieces of their careers, and yet here they sat, silent as he was erased. The memories came unbidden. A winter night when the company was weeks from collapse, he had driven through a snowstorm to secure a contract that barely paid the bills but kept the lights on. A summer when payroll was late, and he put up his own home as collateral just to make sure his employees were paid. Nights where he worked until dawn, missing family dinners, missing milestones, always telling himself it was temporary. And now, these same people treated him like a stranger at his own table. Victor began again, his tone sharper now, trying to keep the momentum. As I was saying, the vote of no confidence will be taken today. It is time for this board to recognize change. He paused, waiting for the usual murmurs of agreement. Instead, silence lingered. Chairs creaked. A pen tapped nervously. Someone cleared their throat. But no words followed. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but it cut clean through the tension. Before you cast your vote, there's something you should know. Something you've all overlooked. The sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples moved across the table. The directors froze. All eyes, unwilling a moment ago, turned toward him. Even Victor's expression faltered for a split second, before he forced a smile. Victor spoke quickly, dismissive. Daniel, you've had your time. Let's not drag this out. Daniel's gaze lifted, sharp, steady. No. You've mistaken my silence for absence. You've mistaken my patience for weakness. But I am still here, and what I have will change everything. The words were precise, cold. The directors exchanged glances. A few leaned forward, curiosity replacing discomfort. Victor laughed lightly, though the sound rang hollow. Change everything. You're grasping, Daniel. You don't have the power you once did. Everyone knows it. Daniel didn't argue. He simply reached down and rested his hand on the briefcase beside him. He didn't open it yet. The gesture alone was enough to shift the mood. The directors stared. The security officer near the wall straightened, uncertain now. Silence stretched. Daniel let it. He wanted them to feel the weight of it. If you've ever been in a room where you were dismissed, where your presence was treated as nothing, you know how powerful silence can be when you decide not to shrink. And if you've faced that moment, share your thoughts here. Because when your story is heard, it reminds others they are not alone. Victor tried to speak again, but his tone betrayed a trace of unease. This is a waste of time. We all know the outcome. Daniel turned his head slowly, his eyes steady on him. His words came calm, cold, deliberate. The only outcome you know is the one you imagined. The truth is still on this table, and before this day ends, every one of you will see it. The board members shifted again, uncertain. A few glanced at the briefcase, as though it held the answer to a question they hadn't realized they were asking. Daniel's silence after that was calculated. He sat back, steady, calm. He didn't need to argue. His presence, his refusal to leave, his quiet confidence, it all unsettled them more than shouting ever could. And if you want to continue hearing stories where silence becomes strength, where presence dismantles betrayal, then stay with this channel. Every story here is a reminder that you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, standing still is enough to change the room. The air thickened. The directors sat restless. Victor forced himself to continue, but his words carried less weight now. Daniel's silent stand had shifted the balance, even if no one wanted to admit it yet. For the first time that morning, it wasn't Victor who controlled the room. It was Daniel. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Daniel didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment settle, his hand resting on the briefcase by his side. Every eye in the room lingered there now, curiosity and unease mixing in equal measure. Finally, with calm precision, Daniel lifted the case and placed it on the table. The sound of the clasps snapping open echoed across the boardroom. No one moved. No one spoke. He slid out a plain folder, thick with documents, unmarked on the outside. He laid it gently on the polished wood in front of him. Then, with deliberate calm, he pushed it forward just enough so Victor could see. Victor forced a laugh. Another prop, Daniel? You think paperwork is going to change where this company is headed? Daniel's voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through every distraction. This isn't a prop. It's an agreement. And every signature on these pages speaks louder than any vote you think you control. Murmurs rippled around the table. The directors leaned closer, their earlier certainty beginning to fracture. One of them whispered, "Agreement? With who?" Another frowned, eyes flicking nervously between Daniel and Victor. Victor smirked, trying to reassert dominance. He tugged the folder toward himself, flipped it open, and glanced at the first page. The smirk vanished. His jaw tightened, but he forced his expression back into neutrality. He closed the folder quickly and shoved it back across the table. Outdated. Irrelevant. Nothing binding here. But his voice lacked conviction, and everyone noticed. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the board. You wanted proof that I am not finished. You wanted to erase my place with a missing chair and a nameplate. But these signatures, these people have not forgotten who built this company. They gave me their trust then, and they have reaffirmed it now. The directors shifted uncomfortably. One of them leaned forward. Is it true? He asked, voice cautious. Daniel slid the folder toward the center. See for yourselves. Every name is there. Investors, partners, stakeholders who still believe in what we built. This is binding. This is the truth you've chosen to ignore. The directors hesitated, glancing at each other. Finally, one reached forward, pulled the folder close, and began to read. The silence deepened as eyes scanned the pages. One by one, their expressions shifted from doubt to surprise to something closer to fear. Victor's voice snapped across the room. "Don't be fooled. He's desperate. He's clinging to scraps." Daniel's reply was calm, cold. "Scraps don't bind contracts. Scraps don't carry weight in courtrooms. Scraps don't hold this much power. You underestimated me because I walked in quietly. That was your mistake." The directors murmured again, louder this time. The balance was shifting. Daniel remembered another time he had been underestimated. Years ago, pitching the company to an investor who dismissed him before the presentation even began. He had walked out that day, humiliated. But 2 years later, when that same investor begged for a seat at the table, Daniel had turned him away. That memory lived inside him now. The reminder that patience wasn't weakness. It was power, waiting for its moment. He turned his gaze back to the board. "I've endured betrayal before. I've carried this company through storms none of you could have survived alone, and I will not be erased by convenience. Not today. Not ever." If you've ever had proof in your hands that others refuse to see, you understand what Daniel feels right now. And if you've lived through that kind of moment, I'd like you to share it. Because stories of standing firm matter most when people try to silence them. Victor's facade cracked further. His hand clenched the armrest of his chair, knuckles white. "This doesn't change the vote," he insisted, voice rising. Daniel's answer was sharp, precise. "It changes everything, because now the board knows the truth, and truth isn't something you can vote away." The folder sat at the center of the table, more powerful than any gavel. The directors looked at Victor, then at Daniel, then back again. For the first time, they weren't sure who held authority. Daniel leaned back, steady, calm. He didn't need to push harder. The documents spoke for him, and if you want to keep hearing stories where betrayal collapses under truth, then stay with this channel. Each story here is a reminder that evidence, patience, and presence can still shatter arrogance. Victor tried to smile again, but it was gone before it formed. His control had slipped. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Daniel. The folder lay open on the table, pages spread where every director could see. The silence had turned heavy, not from dismissal this time, but from realization. For years, Victor had built his reputation on charm, control, and the appearance of inevitability. Today, that facade cracked. The contracts Daniel had produced weren't rumors. They were real, binding, undeniable. A director who had been silent until now cleared his throat. "If this agreement holds," he said cautiously, "then any decision we make without recognizing it could expose us to serious risk." Victor turned sharply toward him. "Risk? The only risk here is clinging to the past. He's finished. We all know it." But no one nodded. No one rushed to agree. Their hesitation spread like a slow fire across the table. Daniel didn't gloat. He sat back in his chair, his expression calm, almost detached. But inside, he felt the shift. The same people who had turned away from him minutes ago were now avoiding Victor's eyes. Another director leaned forward, pushing his glasses up nervously. "Victor, if these signatures are legitimate, and I don't see how they couldn't be then, we've miscalculated." Badly. Victor's jaw tightened. "You're letting him manipulate you. He's desperate. He brought scraps of paper to buy time." Daniel's voice cut through. Cold. Precise. "Scraps don't carry legal weight. Scraps don't bind investors. What you see in front of you is not desperation. It's the truth you ignored while you were busy plotting." The directors murmured again. One of them whispered, "We can't vote on this today. Not like this." Victor slammed his palm against the table, a sharp sound that startled even himself. "Enough. He is not in control anymore." Daniel rose from his chair, He didn't raise his voice, but the firmness in his words silenced the room. You thought removing a chair would remove me. You thought silence would erase my presence. But power doesn't sit in wood and leather. Power sits in the proof you cannot deny. He walked to the far end of the room, gripped a spare chair, and dragged it across the floor. The screech echoed, harsh, deliberate, forcing every person to watch. He placed it at the head of the table, directly where his own had once been, and sat down. The board didn't move. No one objected. Victor's smirk had vanished entirely. His face was pale now, his composure gone. Daniel folded his hands. His tone was calm, but final. This meeting doesn't continue on lies. It continues on truth. And the truth is simple. I am not done here. The directors exchanged glances. One by one, their posture shifted. Shoulders sagged. Eyes dropped. Silence admitted what words could not. Victor's plan had collapsed. Daniel thought of all the nights he had nearly broken under the weight of this company. Nights when the numbers didn't add up, when employees whispered about leaving, when creditors demanded what he didn't have. He had survived all of that. And he had survived this. The fall of the pretenders wasn't marked by shouting. It was marked by silence, by the absence of support, by the cracks spreading through their confidence, by the weight of truth crushing arrogance. If you've ever seen people who pretended to own what you built finally face the truth, you know the quiet satisfaction of that moment. And if you've lived it, I'd like to hear your experience. Share it here not for me, but for everyone who needs to be reminded that truth doesn't stay buried. Victor tried one last time. This isn't finished. You can't just walk back in and reclaim everything. Daniel's reply was cold, sharp. I didn't walk back in. I never left. You only thought I was gone because it suited you to believe it. The directors didn't defend Victor. They didn't argue. Their silence was the final verdict. And if you want to hear more stories where arrogance collapses and dignity stands firm, stay with this channel. Because these aren't just stories about boardrooms, they're stories about life, about refusing to shrink when others try to erase you. Victor sank back into his chair, defeated. The boardroom, once his stage, was no longer his. It belonged again to the man they had tried to exile. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply sat, steady, calm, where he had always belonged at the head of the table. The boardroom no longer belonged to Victor. His silence said more than his words ever could. He sat rigid in his chair, face pale, eyes fixed on the folder he had tried to dismiss. Daniel leaned forward at the head of the table. His voice was calm, but carried weight. I won't waste your time with speeches, but I will remind you of what you've chosen to forget. He turned his gaze to a director at the far end, a man who had avoided his eyes all morning. When your department was on the verge of collapse, who stood behind you and fought for your funding? The man shifted in his seat, saying nothing. Daniel moved his attention to another. When you asked for more resources to save a failing project, who gave you the chance others wanted to deny? The woman's pen froze mid-note. One by one, he went around the table, his words quiet but sharp. Each director remembered. Late-night calls, emergency meetings, second chances. He had been there, not as a figurehead, but as someone who carried their burdens with his own. This company, Daniel continued, was never just numbers on a page. It was built on sacrifice. Sacrifice that I made, and that many of you made alongside me. Respect is not traded in whispers, or stolen with chairs, or silenced with a missing nameplate. Respect is earned, and respect doesn't vanish because someone finds it convenient to erase. The room was still. The directors shifted uneasily, unable to meet his eyes. Their silence wasn't dismissal this time, it was shame. Victor tried to push back, his voice sharp. You're dramatizing, Daniel. This is business. Nothing more. Daniel's reply came cold, precise. Business without loyalty is betrayal, and betrayal has no place at this table. The words struck deep. Even the security officer near the wall, who had stood ready to escort Daniel out earlier, lowered his eyes. Daniel reached forward and slid Victor's nameplate aside. In its place, he set down his own, steady and deliberate. You thought power was in a vote. You thought it was in silence. You thought it was in a chair. But power lives in what you've done for others and what you can still do. Until I decide otherwise, I remain the one who carries that weight. The board did not argue. A few even nodded faintly, as though admitting what they had tried to deny all morning. Daniel remembered another moment years earlier walking into the office after his daughter's school play had ended without him. She had left a drawing on his desk, a stick figure with a briefcase. She had written, "Dad, don't forget us." He had promised himself then that all of this would be worth it, that his sacrifices would mean security for her future. And now, staring at these directors, he realized something. His sacrifices had also carried them. They had just chosen to forget. He would not let them forget again. If you've ever carried others and watched them turn their backs when it suited them, you know how heavy that silence feels. And if you've lived it, I'd like you to speak it here. Because when your story is heard, it reminds others that betrayal doesn't erase the truth. Daniel straightened in his chair. His tone softened slightly, but it remained firm. I am not here to rule you. I am here to remind you of who we are. If you want this company to thrive, then loyalty and respect must return to this table. Without that, none of us survives what comes next. The directors listened, no longer restless. The authority in his voice wasn't forced. It was undeniable. And if stories like this matter to you, about holding ground, about reminding people of the respect they owe, stay with this channel, because there are more truths to be told, and you'll want to hear them. The boardroom was quiet again. But it was a different quiet than before. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't hostility. It was recognition. Respect had been redefined, not by votes, not by silence, but by the man who refused to shrink. The boardroom was silent. The same men and women who had once looked past Daniel now sat with eyes lowered, unwilling to challenge him again. Victor's shoulders slumped, his earlier confidence stripped away. Daniel rose from his chair. He didn't need to say more. He had said enough. He gathered his briefcase, the same one they had tried to make irrelevant, and walked toward the door. Every step carried a steadiness that the room couldn't deny. No one stopped him. No one called after him. The sound of the door opening was louder than anything that had been said all morning. In the hallway, employees stood waiting. They hadn't been inside, but they had heard the tension through the walls. Their eyes followed him, wide, uncertain. One young analyst stepped forward, voice quiet. "Sir, you spoke for all of us today." Daniel gave a small nod. He didn't need applause. He didn't need gratitude. What mattered was that silence had not won. He left the building without ceremony. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Traffic humming, footsteps against the pavement, conversations spilling out of cafes. To them, this was just another day. But for Daniel, it was a reminder. The biggest battles are often invisible to those outside the room. That night, at home, the atmosphere was different. His wife noticed it first. The steadiness in his voice. The way his shoulders no longer carried the same weight. She asked no questions. She didn't need to. She had carried his burdens for years, silently, faithfully. At dinner, his son told him about a school project. His daughter shared a story about a friend. He listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't in a long time. For once, he wasn't distracted by numbers or deadlines. He realized how much he had missed by chasing survival, by carrying the company on his back. Later, when the house was quiet, he sat alone for a moment. The briefcase rested by his chair. He thought about everything. It symbolized sacrifice, betrayal, survival. He didn't feel pride. He felt clarity. The lesson wasn't just for the board. It was for him, too. Respect isn't optional. Dignity isn't something others can give or take away at will. It is claimed by the choices you make when others try to erase you. If you've ever faced a moment where you felt erased, pushed aside, told you didn't belong, I want you to remember this. You do not have to accept silence as your price of peace. And if you're willing, share your story here. Because when stories are spoken, they give strength to others still fighting their own quiet battles. The next morning, Daniel drafted a letter. Not to ask for apologies, not to demand recognition, but to insist on accountability, training, structural changes, safeguards against the kind of betrayal he had faced. He wasn't thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about those who would come after him, people without his platform, without his voice, who could be erased if nothing changed. He knew some would resist. He knew change wouldn't come easily. But he also knew that silence was no longer acceptable. He closed the letter, placed it in his briefcase, and prepared for the next day. There was still work to do, and if these moments matter to you, moments where someone refuses to shrink, where dignity stands taller than betrayal, then stay connected here. Every story we tell is a reminder that presence matters, that truth matters, that your voice matters. As Daniel stepped out of his home into the morning light, there was no triumph in his expression, no smile of victory, only steadiness. The kind of steadiness that comes from knowing that respect had been reclaimed, not just for himself, but for everyone who had watched him stand his ground. And though the boardroom was behind him, the lesson remained. Life will test whether you yield to silence or stand for respect. In that choice, you define who you are.